This would be about 1975, and I hadn't been on the air for a while, and I owned a nightclub out on the Sunset Strip, which is now the Comedy Store, but it was called Art Laboe's then. And I had worked at Ciro's years before, and I knew the owner, Frank Sennis, and I just got this idea to have an oldies but goodies nightclub. So I went out and talked to Frank, and I was on the radio there on. And I got it on to KRLA every Friday and Saturday night right after the hockey game. They had hockey because Jack Kent Cook owned the transmitter, and while KRLA was in limbo, it had lost its license in 1964, and they were in limbo. There were there was originally 21 applicants, and then got it down to 7, one of which was Bob Hope and Art Linkletter and Howard Hughes people, and those people were all spending hundreds of thousands of dollars in this big fight for the KRLA license. But in the meantime, KRLA had kind of gone broke because KHJ knocked them off in the 60s, and I had my show on KRLA from the nightclub. That's all I did. It was just something I paid for it. But the hockey game, not too many people listen to hockey on radio, especially when it's on TV. So the hockey game had a .1 share, and then when my show used to come on, it had a 3 share, which from 11 to 1 at night. I found that out. Well, maybe, we could do more, but in the meantime, KRLA was going to go dark. And there's some people, none of the applicants who were fighting for the license were interested in it because they didn't know where it was going to go. So the license at that time had been given to KCET, and their profits were supposed to go to charity, but there were no profits, and KCET didn't have any money. Nobody wanted to put money in it, so they were trying to sell it. And Drake Chenault, who had radio stations, and Bill Drake, who big programming guy, most of you know, in those days. And so they were dealing with these people about taking it over and some sort of infusion of money and like an LMA that we look at nowadays. And so I talked to the general manager, Hal Matthews, and he said, well, if you want to stay on, he says, I think you know Bill Drake? And I said, yeah. And he says, well, it looks like you'll have to talk to Bill Drake because I think Drake Chenault is going to take over the station and some deal with the FCC and all. And so it turned out that it got down to where it was only Drake Chenault. And then there was K West, which is now Power 106. They wanted it. And but everybody backed away because when they saw the bookkeeping, they saw that it was way in the hole, and nobody wanted to take it on because at any time they would lose the license to one of these applicants. Kind of a long story, but you have to tell it that way to set up what comes next. So I said to Hal Matthews, well, I guess I'll go talk to Bill Drake. He says, well, I'm not sure that's going to happen now. And I said, well, just how much money does it cost to make this deal? And he said, he says, well, guess. And I said, about $250,000. He says, that's a damn good guess because that's real close to what it would take to make this changeover, and that's what they won't do. And I said, well, maybe I'll do it. And he, eyes wide, he says, you have that kind of money? And I said, yeah. And so he says, well, we'll see, what happens. And so it turned out that Drake Chenault were a little shaky about the deal. They weren't sure they wanted it. They already had a station here. I think it was 100.3 at that time. I forget.
KRQQ.
Yeah, that's what it was. And they had either sold it or were still running it. I think they were still running it at that time. But they didn't like it mainly the reason that any day the FCC could give the license to one of the applicants and you were out, because KCET was an interim licensee. So I decided I'd like to do it, take a shot at it. So the first thing I had to do, I told me the engineers were going out to crank up the you know, the generators, because the power company, they had a stack of bills this high, they were going to pull the plug on the power. So he said, well, if we're going to stay on the air, we need $25,000 to give the power company right away. And I said, well, you know, I don't have an agreement yet. He says, well, I think you're going to be the one that, we don't have anybody else, so you're probably going to wind up with it, provided, you know, you can pass the FCC and all this and that. So I wrote him the check for the 25 grand to stay on the air and made a deal. I guess that might be the first LMA that was ever done. I says, well, look on the license, it says Arthur Agnoyan. He says, well, you can't put a name like that on the radio. In those days, you know, you couldn't anyway. Nowadays, any name goes. And so he says, well, you know, I'll go by any name you want. He says, oh, your first name's okay. He looks over and he says, why don't you use Alma's last name? I said, what's her last name? He said, Laboe. That's my secretary. He says, why don't you use Laboe? That's a pretty good name. I said, that gets me the job. He was going to give it to me anyway.
KRLA Radio Lifetime Achievement Award.
Joplin, he did that. Also, the Rocky Horror Show, which was big all over the world and still continues to play. He did all these things, and of course Dunhill Records, which was a very fabulous record, all these things, and many more that I probably don't know about, and lots of philanthropic causes. When that interview was over, we weren't doing anything on the microphone. I think we taped that interview, if I'm not mistaken. And we finished, and we were outside, and the girls were getting a big kick out of talking to Lou. Joanna was one of them right here. And he said, yeah, you know, I said, gee, that was great. I didn't realize just how many things you had done in your life, were doing, and are doing. And I said, you know, I said, gee, you're just so famous and everything. And he says, well, you know something? He says, all that's true what you said, all those things that I told you about.
I'll tell the story. Some of you know Joe Smith, who is the orator of the record business. And Herb Alpert and Jerry Moss were receiving an award, and I was up on the dais. And he went down each person and introduced them. When he got to me, he said, Lou, I've been waiting to introduce this guy for the longest time. How does it feel, after all the gold records and platinum records and hit movies, to be known as the guy with the hat and the beard that sits next to Jack Nicholson?
That's what Lou says, famous.